In 1986, a young couple from Bangladesh arrived in Saudi Arabia chasing a promise. The husband, a computer engineer, the wife, a bright, driven woman who had put all her ambitions on hold for her family. Their names, Rihana Saleh and Salahuddin Ahmad. In their modest apartment surrounded by the humdrum of an oil rich kingdom, they raised their little girl, Ruby. And on December 12th of 1986, a new cry echoed through their homes, and a baby boy with big brown eyes, chubby cheeks, a boy they named a scholar in Arabic, Fahim, was finally born. And a few years after that, the family moved yet again, packed everything, and this time they moved to the United States, and specifically to Louisiana. The reason was Saleh had been accepted into a PhD program in computer science. He would study and Rihanna would work, but their two children would get to grow up in a country far away from their own, but with these immense opportunities. Their plan was simple, and the plan was a better life. In 1991, their third child, Rifat, was born, and now a family of five. They decide to move yet again, and this time it was a move towards the north of the country, to the quiet upstate town of Poughkeepsie, New York. And it was here, surrounded by the snow, surrounded by second-hand furniture, a small but cozy house, and a whole new set of friends, that they tried to make ends meet. And then something shifted one day when Fahim overheard his parents talk. He was barely 10 years old, and he overheard a conversation between his parents about the stress of oncoming bills, and maybe the groceries were going to be a little low this month. So the next week, Fahim, being Fahim, shows up to the school with candy. No, not to eat, but to sell. And the hustle had truly begun. At 10 years old, Fahim wasn't thinking about video games or cartoons. He was thinking about margins, ladies and gentlemen, about inventory, about his upselling strategy. He sold candy to his classmates at a marked up price, and this was his first true taste of profit. By the time Fahim was 12 years old, and then the next thing he starts selling, turns out, is jewelry, handmade jewelry marketed to his neighborhood kids. Fahim, as a middle schooler, already had two businesses. By the time he turns 12, Fahim had taught himself how to code. Now, even when I say that, it just sounds so insane. His family, though, was not surprised. His father was a computer engineer, of course, and this sort of ran in his blood. By the time he was in the eighth grade, Fahim had launched his first company, websites for others, small businesses, friends, whoever would pay him, he would create a website for them. By then, he had come into his next creation, a monetized humor site for fellow teenagers, a company by the name, a website by the name of Monkey Do. Now, think about things like jokes and pranks and fart spray and fake poop. That's the kind of things that he was selling. Well, juvenile, yes, but he was a teenager himself. Profitable, oh, yes, he was profitable. And the next venture that he got into was prankdial.com, and this put him on the digital map. The website allowed users to send prank calls to their friends. For all those of us who are millennials, we know what that feels like. Gen Z would probably never know all this, but it was all meant for harmless fun, and this turned out to be internet gold for Fahim. By this time, Fahim wasn't just running websites, he was running an empire. And by the time it was the year 2003, Fahim was launching company after company. His parents, of course, were extremely proud, but also worried because he was trading textbooks for business plans. And then came a moment that changed everything. Fahim, by this time, gets his first check of $500 from Google AdSense. This was real money and earned him real clicks on real websites. His father, Salahuddin Ahmed, did not hesitate. He took Fahim straight to the bank and helped Fahim open his first official business bank account. And around this time, the family moved again to yet another part of upstate New York, a small town with a big heart. There, Salahuddin Ahmed and Rehana made a decision that truly echoed how much they believed in their son. They gave him the biggest room in the house, which wasn't a luxury for this teenager. He had basically turned that room into his business empire. It was his office. Fahim called this new business venture of his Wiz Teen, a network of dozens of teenage focused websites that he had put together. Now, think of something like avatar creators for AIM and other messaging platforms. Think tools where you can customize your online identity at a time when online identity was in its nascent stage. By the age of 17, Fahim had enough money to put himself through Bentley University in Massachusetts. But success had had a cost. Fahim would often be so absorbed in his projects that he would forget to eat. Now, which is something that I truly dream of. I don't think I've ever had a moment in life when I've forgotten to eat, but hopefully one day I will. And that would probably signal that I'm that successful that I even forget to eat. His father, of course, would quickly knock on his door and say, "You've forgotten to eat, my dear," and would offer him what the family called a surprise sandwich, which basically meant that Salahuddin would open his fridge and put everything inside two slices of bread and give it to the son. This was a surprise sandwich. But this was so heartwarming because they could see that their son was working so hard. So, by this time, the family knew that all this for Fahim was more than just a side hustle. By this time, Fahim had reached college and his online ventures were making more than six figures. He was, in fact, a teenage CEO. And this was all before being a teenage CEO became the normal thing. You know, we now see these bros out on internet trying to be crypto kings. It was much before that. This was in the 2000s. Ultimately, Fahim graduated with flying colors from Bentley University in Massachusetts, and at the same time, he was also a tech mogul in the making. Now let's start with chapter 2, the betrayal of Fahim Saleh. 10 years later, by 2019, Fahim Saleh was truly on top of the world. He was living in a penthouse in Lower East Side of Manhattan, a career that had stretched him from upstate New York to New York, to Dhaka, and even to Laos. His footprint was everywhere. In fact, he had created businesses which still thrive. Businesses like Gokada was truly blooming. So was Pathao, and he was also the VC of a firm called Adventure Capital, and all this was gaining even more momentum. It was almost like Fahim was just getting started. At this time, Fahim was 33 years old. He was single, extremely focused, and always building one thing after another, one thing after another. And that's when 2020 came, and we all remember what 2020 was. A global pandemic hit, followed by a lockdown and a moment of silence that no one expected. It was the second week of July when 3 days had passed and nobody in the Saleh family had heard from Fahim at all. Now, his cousin, who was also a software engineer, happened to be living in New York City. And that's when the entire worried family gets in touch with her and they tell her, "Go and check on Fahim. There is something strange because he's not responding to his calls." Now, the cousin arrives at Fahim's penthouse on Tuesday, July 14 of 2020. Fahim lived on the seventh floor and there was no doors inside the building's secure elevator system. The elevator actually opened directly into Fahim's private residence. It's one of those buildings. And when the door opened, the cousin walked into something which was nothing short of an actual horror film. It was so horrific, in fact, that one investigator who later threw up, said, "Quote, straight out of Dexter," unquote. What the police and the cousin found was in the middle of Fahim Saleh's living room was a headless torso. There was blood absolutely everywhere. And the poor unsuspecting cousin who was just there to look after the well-being of Fahim runs out of the building screaming at the top of her lungs because she had witnessed something which nobody ever should. Of course, goes without saying, after a few minutes, the NYPD arrives very quickly and they cordon off the entire scene. And that's when they began to look at the CCTV footage and they saw something which was truly chilling. On 8:37 a.m. of Monday, July 13, which was a day before, the security cameras capture a man, a very tall man with a completely dark outfit. His head was covered, he had a duffel bag in his hand, and he was in the building's lobby. He stayed there not for 1 hour, not for 2 hours. He waited in that lobby for 5 hours for him to emerge from his apartment. And then, around 1:41 p.m. in the afternoon, Fahim finally returned from his jog. We can see on the CCTV footage that Fahim returns from his jog. The elevator security footage then shows that Fahim Saleh steps into the elevator, and so does this tall, imposing figure whose face is completely covered with a mask, which was the norm. I mean, you remember 2020, that's how things were. And this man follows Fahim, this man who was dressed in a suit, in a white shirt, in a tie, in a baseball cap, in sunglasses, and a medical mask, did not raise any suspicions in this building because that was the norm. That's how all of us dressed at that time. We pretty much all wore hazmat suits if we could. But what happened next would haunt the Saleh family for the rest of their lives. As the elevator reaches the seventh floor, just before the doors open, this tall man tased Fahim Saleh in the neck and incapacitated him completely. This taser, by the way, can be purchased online for something as less as $390, and this is called Taser Plus. It knocks a person out within 10 to 30 seconds, depending on your size. And then we see that the elevator doors close and we cannot see any footage after that. Then around 2:30 p.m., which was almost an hour later, the elevator doors open again and the same man, the same tall man, reappears again. This time his clothes are completely different. He's now wearing a light colored hoodie, dark pants and sneakers, and he's carrying a purple handheld vacuum with which he begins to vacuum the entire elevator. The reason was that the taser that he had used had released tiny, tiny cartridges, which were small circular cartridges, kind of like confetti tags, and he was trying to vacuum all of them. And thankfully, this killer missed one teeny tiny confetti tag. This unique tiny tag with the number 1001335579 is the magic number. This is how the police later was able to get in touch with the man with the taser. Through records, authorities were able to trace the purchase of this taser, and through the FedEx delivery system in Brooklyn, they saw that this taser was given to someone in Brooklyn a month before the day of the attack on Fahim Saleh. So, if nothing else, this whole planning was a month in the making. Who was the recipient of this taser gun, you ask, right? Well, it was the 21-year-old assistant of Fahim Saleh, a man the entire family knew extremely well. This 21-year-old was given a break by Fahim Saleh, and this 21-year-old man went by the name of Tyrese Haspel. Chapter 3, The Embezzler. The police arrested Tyrese Haspel, and what they uncovered was a saga which was years in the making. It was a saga of betrayal, it was a saga of theft, of cold calculation, and embezzlement. Back in January of 2020, Fahim Saleh had noticed that $35,000 were charged from his Capital Adventure account, and he did not really recognize this big charge of $35,000. So, Fahim, being Fahim, very politely emails Tyrese Haspel, his assistant, and says, quote, "My memory must be failing me, but I don't remember authorizing such charges. Can you please explain?" Unquote. To which Tyrese Haspel replies, quote, "Thanks for bringing this to my attention. Must be a clerical error." Unquote. The tone, however, between the two men shifts over the weekend. On Saturday night, around 11 p.m., Fahim emailed him again and pressed a little harder. And that's when Tyrese Haspel finally confessed to Fahim, quote, "I was desperate. I needed money to pay off my debt and help my family. I'm ready to take responsibility." Unquote. And Fahim, being the lovely man that he was, completely self made, who came from a humble, giving family, and ever the optimist, agreed that there should be a 12-month repayment plan by which Tyrese Haspel would give $35,000 back to Fahim. Fahim's lawyers drafted this legal document, a promissory note, um, and a notarized confession. Think about this. It was such a generous offer. What a forgiving boss. I mean, wouldn't we all love a boss like that? And Fahim never involved the police in this. But what Fahim didn't know was that the theft was not just $35,000, and this whole thing ran much deeper. Haspel had in fact created a fake PayPal account under the name of Nethertech Switzerland. Between December of 2018 and May of 2019, Tyrese Haspel had in fact embezzled a total of $98,849,000. In the meantime, supposedly Tyrese Haspel was making repayments to Fahim, but none of this was ever real. Since he was Fahim's assistant, he was able to fake statements that he showed to Fahim saying that I'm paying you back. In fact, it was all nothing but a web of deception, one lie upon another, one day at a time. And now, when we come back to the crime scene of how brutally Fahim Saleh was murdered, we see another revealing moment of this crime scene which takes it beyond what Dexter did. The autopsy, in fact, revealed that Fahim was still conscious even after the taser attack. And Fahim, being Fahim, fought back. He suffered 5 stab wounds to his neck and his torso. He had defensive wounds all over his arms and his hands. He had cut on his forearms. All this was evidence of a struggle. He was trying to live. Later that night, a figure resembling Tyrese Haspel is again seen on CCTV footage, and this time, this figure is dumping things into the Hudson River. And later on, the NYPD divers were able to search the contents of the Hudson River and were able to get these essential pieces of evidence. The motive, in fact, is quite simple, almost a tale as old as time. Tyrese Haspel. Tyrese Haspel was simply greedy and jealous of his ever loving, ever forgiving boss, Fahim Saleh. Tyrese Haspel had access to everything. He had access to passwords, to bank accounts, to PIN numbers, to emails, and he knew that if he would be reported, this would be the end of the sweet life that he was living on someone else's dime. So rather than work like Fahim, like an honest man, he chose violence and he chose to kill Fahim Saleh. The most devastating detail of this all is just 3 days before Fahim was supposed to be buried in Hudson Valley, Fahim Saleh's sister Ruby got a call from the funeral home, and what she heard next is truly unfathomable. The funeral home calls her up and lets her know that they will not be able to sew back all the limbs and the head and the torso of Fahim Saleh together. Imagine that. The final moment in which they could have seen Fahim and said goodbye to their son and their brother, they would never have that moment with him because he was not whole. And then the day before the service, on July 19th, they got a call yet again. This time they said that they had managed to piece him back together. However, one day later, through some miraculous intervention of God, they were able to get all his pieces together and they were able to sew him back. So the family was finally able to say goodbye to him. However, just because they were able to bury him, it would never undo the pain that this family has had to go through for an absolutely senseless killing. Fahim wasn't just a tech genius with a string of companies. He wasn't just the founder of Pathao and Gokada. He was someone who was truly generous, someone who would never forget where he came from, someone who always extended his hand to his fellow man for those who were in extreme and dire need, just like Tyrese Haspel was once in dire need. And his trust and his benevolence was used as a weapon against him. As if all this betrayal was not enough. When Tyrese Haspel was finally taken to the court, imagine this man said he is not guilty. That's right, in October 2020, Tyrese Haspel in fact entered a non guilty plea to second degree murder, grand larceny, burglary, tampering with evidence, and concealment of a human corpse. Meanwhile, the authorities uncovered hours of surveillance of Tyrese Haspel going all around New York using Fahim's credit cards, jumping from one cab to the other, going on shopping sprees, and picking up happy birthday balloons, the shape of a heart. They also see Tyrese Haspel go into several high end stores all over Soho, and with him, he has a female friend as well. And he passed himself off as this rich man um, who was earning all this money himself, which he truly wasn't. And the man who truly deserved all this was killed and betrayed by Tyrese Haspel, a simple man who never truly enjoyed all the money that he had made. In fact, he was very generous towards his sister. When his sister wanted to get married, he actually took the bill of the sister's wedding. He was a generous person to everyone around him and was a go-getter. He was just setting one company after another and never truly enjoyed anything that he had, was never able to enjoy the money that he had made. Tyrese Haspel, the police has footage of Tyrese Haspel going into Fahim's penthouse when Fahim was in Laos, was in Dhaka, establishing these businesses, or months on end not being in his penthouse. And he brings women over, he sleeps in Fahim's bed, he spends Fahim's money, he dresses up better than Fahim ever did. And all this wealth that Fahim had built brick by brick, penny upon penny, over as a 10-year-old, someone who started out as a 10-year-old. What an absolute betrayal. Now, let's go forward from the year 2020 when Fahim Saleh was killed to July of 2023, which was 3 years later. 3 years later, Tyrese by this time was 24 years old, and he stood in court again and he pleaded not guilty. He refused to acknowledge what he had done. He was still clinging to the hope that he could manipulate the system, but the evidence, there's mountain of evidence. There's a whole digital trail. There is the surveillance footage. We have motive here. We have a confession that he gives to the police. We have the Taser ID, which connects him back to the Taser that he bought for $299. We see him vacuuming the confetti, Taser confetti, in Fahim's elevator. We have evidence that he bought a saw to dismember Fahim's body with clinical precision. But despite all this mountain of evidence, Tyrese Haspel is not ready to admit that he did all this. Justice has been delayed here. Let's hope that justice has not been denied here, because it's people like Tyrese Haspel who are manipulators, who are con men, who betray their friends, who betray people in their lives pretending to be friends. um, and all they use in the justice system is one distraction after another or one excuse after another. Fahim's story is unfortunately a cautionary tale. It reminds us that at times there's a cost to our kindness, that we ought to protect people from such con men around us, especially people we know who are extremely generous with their time, their energy, their money. Unfortunately, because of Tyrese Haspel, we now know that sometimes it's people who are closest to us who are the wolf in sheep's clothing. So that's the end of this narrative. But let's now try to understand this unfathomable crime from a legal point of view. And let's also try to understand the criminological analysis of why somebody like Tyrese Haspel would victimize somebody as sweet and gentle as Fahim Saleh. Okay, so let's just start with the legal and the criminological analysis of this case. Now, when I had initially released this video last year, in which you do not see my face, but you do hear my voice, um, that was around February of 2024. And at that time, the case against Tyrese Haspel was pending. He was in jail at that time, but the court case hadn't proceeded any further. However, I do have some good news for you. In September of 2024, Tyrese Haspel was finally taken through the rigors of the legal system, and he did stand trial for the killing and dismemberment and the embezzlement and the grand larceny against Fahim Saleh. On September 10 of 2024, Tyrese Haspel was in fact sentenced to 40 years in jail for the murder and dismemberment of Fahim Saleh. The New York jury said that he was guilty on all counts and charged him with first degree murder, tampering of evidence, concealment of a human corpse, grand larceny, and embezzlement. And interestingly, initially, when you heard my narrative, I did tell you that what Fahim knew of was basically embezzlement worth around 98 point something thousand dollars. In fact, the whole thing, when the whole thing went for trial, what we get to know is beyond measure, which is that Fahim was under the impression that it was close to 99,000 dollars. In fact, he had embezzled $400,000 in a very sophisticated financial scheme, and he had been pilfering this money from the coffers of Fahim Saleh's different companies. But despite the decision of Fahim Saleh, where he chose to forgive this person and was so generous and said, Here's a repayment plan and give me whatever you can over a long period of time," even then, Haspel decided to brutally kill Fahim Saleh and basically live off of that money. Now, I would love to get into the criminological theory of this all, but though I'm not a psychologist, I did speak to Sam, who hosts this podcast with me. And if you truly want to hear what she has to say, you should definitely log in to the audio version of this podcast on Apple and Spotify. But what she said, I can tell you that a little bit over here, but it will not have the sophistication of her words, but I'll try. She said that according to her, um, it seems like the psychological profile of somebody like Tyrese Haspel shows that he was basically a sociopath, because he would score extremely high on the hair's checklist, because Tyrese Haspel had superficial charm, he was extremely manipulative, he shows an absolute and utter lack of remorse and guilt for what he's done, and he was criminally extremely versatile. Not only is he a murderer, a thief, a fraud, he's all rolled into one. So, truly, he does rank extremely high on Hare's psychopathy checklist. Instead of gratitude against Fahim Saleh, instead of falling on his knees and saying, "Thank you, boss, for not taking me to the police," he in fact escalated and killed his boss and dismembered him into teeny tiny pieces. He was cold and detached. He was calculated in his behavior, which is truly typical of a sociopath and someone who's an antisocial human being. Now, here, if we look at a criminological analysis, just like I tell all my students, you can always utilize Robert Merton's stain theory in most cases, and truly in this one as well, we can, because it does seem like the crime occurs because for Tyrese Haspel, the social goals that he wants to live up to, what he sees around him in this high flying society of Manhattan, which reveres wealth and hard work, he starts to take a shortcut. Why should I work when a supposed idiot of a boss who's so generous that he's willing to overlook the ills that I've done, instead of falling on his knees and thanking Fahim Saleh for his generosity and his understanding, he becomes obsessed with Fahim's wealth and the lifestyle that Fahim is able to afford. Um, and by the way, if you ever look at his pictures, he was an extremely humble sort of tech entrepreneur, like literally just walking around in a t shirt. And he was constantly spending money on his family and his loved ones and constantly helping out obscure people in Bangladesh and obscure entrepreneurs all over the world. So rather than spending all this money on himself, he was constantly doing well for others. And Fahim Fahim's money is something that this vampire of a man, Tyrese Haspel, latches onto, and all he sees is wealth. And to get to that wealth, he resorts to fraud and violence, and as a shortcut to achieve what society expects all of us to do. Because if we apply social learning theory, because Tyrese Haspel does not is not taken to the police immediately for the crimes that he had done, he in fact learns that I can get away with this. So in that sense, the lack of consequences sort of reinforces to him that he's free to do other deceptive things, which also includes the premeditating killing of his boss. In no way am I trying to blame the victim for him, Saleh. Absolutely not doing that. But I'm just saying that it does seem to happen where if people aren't checked the second they commit their first crime, they seem to do it again. And then when you give someone an inch, they will take a mile. And that's what seems to have happened in this case. We can also see that there's an extreme sort of offensive behavior here. He really premeditated it. He ordered the taser a month in advance. He waits for 5 hours in a lobby to stalk Fahim Saleh to get into his elevator and then to ultimately go to his floor, tase him in the elevator, and then kill him and dismember his body. And he even his post crime behavior is extremely disturbing, where he's walking around Manhattan with luxury cars, getting Airbnb for his girlfriend, buying her expensive things, buying himself expensive things, designer bags, so on and so forth. So all this shows a truly cold and calculated mindset, um, which as a narcissist he just could see that all this wealth is being taken away from him. And in this loss of wealth, he sees a way out. He sees that he can probably just kill Fahim Saleh in the middle of the pandemic. Nobody would see anything and nobody would be the wiser, and that's what he decided to do. So this was nothing but wanton violence. So we've come to the end of this extremely sad case. What a loss, not only to the Saleh family, but what a loss to the world to have a man like Fahim Saleh die in such circumstances, be killed in such circumstances. We can give each other, though, so much more than just our thoughts and prayers. We can give each other our collective vigilance. I look forward to hearing from you in the comments. If you think I got something wrong in terms of my analysis, please let me know. Until I see you again, Let's stay collectively vigilant.